You spot something glowing in the yard. It's metallic green, coppery red, with a curved horn just like a jeweled rhino. Now, you'd guess that it's rare, exotic, maybe even gross, but it's not. It's a dung beetle, and it navigates by starlight, pushing 1,000 times its own weight. Today, let's meet this fascinating creature. The myth surrounding dung beetles is less a single false claim and more a complete absence of awareness. Most people in North America have never knowingly encountered one and have no model at all for what these insects are doing in their environment. The rainbow scarab specifically is mistaken for a Japanese beetle so consistently that entomologists documenting its populations note the misidentification as a routine challenge for citizen science reporting. The Japanese beetle is an invasive pest species that damages plants and lawns. The rainbow scarab is a native beneficial insect doing exactly the opposite. Getting them confused isn't neutral. It regularly results in people killing one of their lawn's most useful residents out of a reflex, conditioned by the genuine problem of the other. The deeper misconception, though, is about what dung beetles are for at all. Most people, when they think about the ecological role of waste removal in nature, think of flies and bacteria, the visible, unwelcome side of decomposition. Dung beetles almost never enter that mental picture, and what gets lost in that gap is the full scale of what these insects are actually doing. Not just removing surface waste, but actively cycling nutrients into soil, reducing parasite loads, suppressing fly populations, aerating compacted ground, and, in the case of the ball rollers who navigate by starlight, performing a feat of celestial orientation that, before 2013, science didn't know any insect could do. To understand how an insect doing something that specific ended up in your backyard, we need to start roughly 130 million years ago. Hey, real quick, please do subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I make regular deep dive documentaries about truly amazing insects, animals, and plants that secretly help you. There's lots of unique content coming out soon, so make sure to turn on the bell notification as well. Okay, back to the video now. Dung beetles belong to the family Scarabaeidae and the subfamily Scarabaeinae, the true dung beetles, a group of roughly 6,000 described species distributed across every continent except Antarctica. But the deeper question of when and how they got into this particular business was, until recently, genuinely unsettled. The dominant assumption for most of the 20th century was that dung beetles co-evolved with mammals, that when large herbivorous mammals spread across the Paleogene landscape roughly 60 to 65 million years ago, dung beetles diversified alongside the enormous new food resource they created. Then a team led by Dr. Nicole Gunter of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History generated molecular DNA sequence data from 450 scarab beetle species and ran the analysis. The divergence dates that came back didn't support a mammal origin. They placed the first evolution of dung-feeding behavior in the lower Cretaceous period, somewhere between 115 and 130 million years ago, at least 30 million years earlier than previous estimates, and squarely in the middle of the age of dinosaurs. The mammals alive at that point were small, insect-eating creatures producing dry, tiny pellets of waste, nothing a dung beetle could build a life around. The animals producing dung in volume were dinosaurs, and fossilized dinosaur coprolites, basically preserved feces, dated to 70 to 80 million years ago, have been found showing tunneling patterns consistent with dung beetle feeding. The surviving lineages after the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction 66 million years ago were, by the researchers' best hypothesis, species that had either fed on other organic matter or were generally flexible enough to shift resources when the dinosaur dung supply disappeared. When large mammals began to diversify in the Paleogene, those surviving dung beetle lineages were already equipped with the biology and behavior to exploit the new opportunity, and they diversified explosively alongside their new hosts. The species alive today are grouped by behavior into three broad functional types, a classification that matters for understanding what's happening in your specific backyard. First, the rollers. This is the most famous type, the ones photographed navigating open African savannas with perfectly spherical dung balls. Detach a piece of dung, sculpt it into a sphere, and roll it away from the source to a private location before burying it. Then you have the tunnelers, which excavate directly beneath a dung deposit, pulling material down into underground chambers. Lastly, you have the dwellers, who simply live and breed inside the dung pad itself without relocating it. Most North American species, including the rainbow scarab, are tunnelers. They dig straight down under whatever waste they've found, pull it underground, and construct brood chambers where both feeding and reproduction happen entirely out of sight. What triggers the rainbow scarab's arrival is smell. Phanius vindex can detect the chemical compounds in fresh dung from considerable distances, and like other dung beetles, shows documented preferences based on the specific olfactory profile of the source, with research showing they are most strongly attracted to the most aromatic, nutritionally complex waste, particularly from animals with highly varied diets including swine, opossum, dog, and raccoon. In a suburban yard, that means dog waste is an active attractant. A dog owner who has noticed a shiny beetle appearing near their pet's usual area and wondered where it came from now has their answer. Before moving on to the mechanism, it's worth dwelling briefly on the sheer scale of scarabini diversity, because the rainbow scarab, for all its beauty, represents only one solution to a problem the family has been solving in dozens of fundamentally different ways across the planet. The approximately 6,000 species in this subfamily are found in habitats as varied as tropical rainforest canopy, open desert, montane grassland, and dense temperate woodland. Africa alone hosts a particularly extraordinary diversity. Species specialized for specific animals' dung, species active only in narrow temperature windows, species that have evolved to carry hitchhiking mites on their bodies from one dung deposit to another in a documented mutualistic relationship where the mites eat insect eggs in the dung and the beetle gets free transport. The rainbow scarab does this too. The predatory mite Macrocheles amygdalagera is commonly found riding on Phanius vindex adults in exactly that relationship, using the beetle as a taxi between feeding sites. What looks like a solitary insect is sometimes carrying a community. Understanding how the tunneler does what it does underground requires a brief tour of anatomy, because the rainbow scarab in particular is built for a very specific kind of labor. Those serrated front legs aren't decorative, they're engineered digging tools, reinforced and thickened relative to the rest of the body. The horn on the male's head, which looks purely ornamental, actually serves two documented functions. In male-to-male competition over access to dung deposits and females, males use the horns to pry rivals out of tunnels. But the horn also acts as a leverage tool during digging, pressed against tunnel walls to generate downward force. In some large males, the horn can be as long as the body itself. What happens underground follows a consistent sequence. Once the beetle locates a suitable dung deposit, it excavates a primary tunnel descending directly beneath it, pushing excavated soil up and out to the side in a visible mound, the small cone of disturbed earth that sometimes tips a gardener off to the beetle's presence before they ever see the insect. From that main shaft, the female forms brood balls, carefully packed spheres of dung, each of which receives a single egg before being sealed into a side chamber off the main tunnel. The male typically remains in the tunnel, actively guarding against rivals and occasionally passing additional dung material down to the female during the brood ball forming process. The larvae that hatch have one resource, the dung ball they're sealed inside. They feed through multiple developmental stages, instars, consuming and processing the material completely before pupating and eventually emerging as adults. At no point do the larvae surface. The entire developmental cycle happens underground, which is why most gardeners with active rainbow scarab populations never see any sign of them beyond the occasional hole and mound near a dung deposit. What happens to the dung itself during all this is the part with direct consequences for your soil. The beetles physically remove material from the surface and deposit it into the subsoil, where bacteria can break it down efficiently rather than losing the bulk of the nutrients to evaporation and surface runoff. Research measuring soil nutrient profiles under dung deposits with and without beetle activity consistently finds significantly elevated nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium concentrations in the soil beneath active tunneler activity compared to dung left untouched. One analysis found that large-bodied tunneling species can increase soil macronutrient concentrations by roughly 45% compared to unworked dung. Critically, about 80% of the nitrogen in surface dung is normally lost through ammonia volatilization, but when dung beetles bury the material quickly, that loss is reduced to somewhere between 5 and 15%. What those percentages represent in practice is free, continuous, targeted fertilization happening in the exact zone where plant roots are actively feeding. There is one more function worth naming here that gets almost no coverage in popular treatments is secondary seed dispersal. Dung frequently contains the seeds of whatever fruits or plants the producing animal has eaten. When dung beetles bury that dung, the seeds come along, pre-deposited at the right depth, in a nutrient-rich substrate, in a protected location away from the surface. The role of large dung beetles as inadvertent seed planters in moving viable seeds from where an animal deposited them to where they have the best chance of germination is a documented and ecologically significant contribution to forest and grassland regeneration that requires no additional behavior from the beetle at all. It simply happens as a side effect of the tunneling. And then there is the question of sheer mechanical strength relative to body weight. Dung beetles are documented as among the strongest animals on Earth. Some species of Onthophagus have been measured pulling loads exceeding 1,000 times their own body weight, the equivalent scaled to human size of pulling 6 double-decker buses. The muscle architecture that produces that force is part of what makes the tunneling possible in compacted suburban soil, not just the loose substrates of savanna or forest floor. The most famous chapter in the human relationship with dung beetles is also one of the most formally remarkable in all of entomology. Ancient Egypt built an entire theological architecture around a dung beetle, and the specific reason why, the behavior the Egyptians observed and interpreted, turns out to be directly connected to the navigational biology that stunned modern science in 2013. The scarab in question is Scarabaeus sacer, the sacred scarab of North Africa, a ball-rolling species whose behavior was visible and legible to any observer who spent time in the landscape where both beetles and humans lived. Egyptian artists and priests watched a ball-rolling scarab emerge from nowhere, sculpt a perfect sphere from what was available, and roll it across open ground in an impossibly straight line, guided by nothing visible to the human eye. The sphere was pushed toward the horizon, toward the east, along the same axis as the rising sun. And from the apparently dead ball, after a period of underground concealment, new life emerged. The theological interpretation built from those observations was specific and layered. The god Khepri, whose name derives from the Egyptian root for to become or to transform, was depicted with a scarab beetle head and was understood to push the sun across the sky each morning the way the beetle pushes its ball across the earth. The spontaneous emergence of new beetles from the buried ball confirmed, to Egyptian observers, the connection between the scarab and the principle of self-creation and solar rebirth. Khepri was not a minor deity. He was one of the 3 solar manifestations of Ra, representing the rising sun specifically, the aspect of renewal and becoming that begins each day. Scarab amulets became among the most produced objects in ancient Egyptian material culture, used as seals, worn as jewelry, placed over the hearts of the dead as protective talismans and carried into battle. The scarab was present in nearly every domain of Egyptian life for thousands of years, all because someone watched a beetle roll a ball of dung in a straight line across open ground. What they couldn't have known, but observed the effects of, is that the straight line was not coincidental. It was the product of one of the most sophisticated celestial navigation systems ever discovered in the insect world. The discovery that launched 1,000 headlines came from a somewhat unglamorous research setup, a circular arena 10 feet across built in an open field in South Africa, where researchers from Lund University, led by biologist Marie Dacca, watched dung beetles navigate under a full range of conditions: bright moonlight, partial cloud cover, and complete overcast, as well as under clear, moonless skies dominated by starlight alone. What Dacke and her colleagues already knew from prior work was that ball-rolling dung beetles use the sun during the day and the moon at night as compass references, not to navigate toward a specific destination, but to maintain a straight line away from the competitive chaos of the dung pile, where other beetles are constantly trying to steal a finished ball. The biology of that straight line orientation had been studied for years. What nobody had tested was what happened on moonless nights when the sky was clear. The beetles kept rolling in straight lines. Not perfectly straight, the paths degraded somewhat compared to moonlit conditions, but substantially straighter than the controls in which the beetles' view of the sky was blocked entirely, which produced chaotic circling paths. The researchers suspected starlight, but individual stars are far too dim for an insect eye to resolve as individual points. The Milky Way, though, the combined glow of the galactic plane, which on a clear, dark night in the southern hemisphere appears as a luminous band spanning the sky, is something else. To test whether that band, rather than individual stars, was the cue, the team took beetles into a planetarium in Johannesburg and ran trials with the full star field projected, then with only the Milky Way band without individual stars, and finally with the sky blocked entirely. Beetles with the full star field navigated straight, whereas beetles with only the Milky Way band navigated almost as straight. Beetles with the sky blocked could not maintain direction. Published in Current Biology in January 2013, the paper by Dacke and co-authors Marcus Byrne, Emily Baird, Clark Schultz, and Eric Warrant confirmed the first documented use of the Milky Way for orientation by any animal other than humans, birds, and seals, and the first time it had been demonstrated in any insect. A follow-up line of research from the same Lund University group has since examined what happens to that navigation system under artificial light. A study published in Current Biology in 2021 found that light pollution from urban and suburban environments forces measurable changes in dung beetle orientation behavior, that beetles in lit conditions attempt to use artificial light sources as navigational references the way they would normally use celestial cues, producing systematically distorted paths that take them away from their intended direction rather than toward it. It is one of the more direct demonstrations of a mechanism by which suburban light pollution harms beneficial insects in ways that don't involve any direct contact with the animal at all, just a bright enough porch light to interfere with a navigation system 130 million years in the making. The practical reason the behavior exists is entirely competitive. A beetle that rolls its dung ball in a straight line gets away from the pile fastest, which means it loses its ball to rivals least often, which means it reproduces more successfully. The celestial navigation system is, at its core, an evolved solution to the problem of theft in a competitive food market, and it happens to require the same broad-scale astronomical reference that ancient human navigators used to cross open oceans. The economic scale of what this entire family of insects is doing for human agriculture has only recently been formally quantified. A landmark analysis published in Ecological Entomology estimated the total economic value of dung beetle beetle ecosystem services to the US extensively pastured beef cattle industry at $380 million annually through nutrient cycling, parasite suppression, pest fly control, and reduced pasture fouling. A comparable assessment for the UK cattle industry arrived at approximately £367 million per year in combined benefits. A broader review published in 2024 put the cumulative annual ecosystem service value of dung beetles in the United States at approximately $5.9 billion when all agricultural sectors are included. The insect that most people have never knowingly identified is doing invisible, continuous work whose monetary equivalent is in the billions. That value is under threat in ways that parallel what's happening to pollinator populations more broadly. Routine use of antiparasitic veterinary drugs, particularly macrocyclic lactone dewormers like ivermectin, passes through livestock into their dung in concentrations that are directly toxic to dung beetles. Research cited in the UK cattle industry analysis specifically found that unnecessary routine deworming of adult cattle costs the industry millions annually in lost beetle ecosystem services beyond the direct cost of the drugs themselves. Habitat loss, the conversion of diverse pasture to monoculture cropland, and urbanization are simultaneously reducing the landscape connectivity that dung beetle populations need to remain viable. A problem documented specifically for the rainbow scarab, whose populations on fragmented urban farms show no dispersal between sites even short distances apart. If you find a rainbow scarab or another native dung beetle in your yard, the correct response is simply to leave it. It is not a pest. It does not damage plants, it does not bite, it does not sting, and its presence near animal waste is precisely what makes it valuable. If you have dogs or other animals whose waste accumulates in your yard, a dung beetle population nearby is doing free, continuous removal and soil integration of that material in a way that nothing else does as precisely or efficiently. The most practical thing a suburban gardener or property owner can do to support native dung beetle populations is to reduce or eliminate the use of broad-spectrum pesticides in and around lawn areas, particularly soil insecticides and residual surface sprays that contact the beetle during its above-ground foraging phase. If you have livestock, consult with a veterinarian before defaulting to routine macrocyclic lactone dewormers, and explore whether treatment timing can be shifted to avoid the peak activity season for local dung beetles, typically late spring through early summer in most of North America. For those who want to actively attract and support them, the beetles are drawn to dung, and the most nutritionally complex and aromatically rich waste is most attractive. In a practical setting, this means not immediately cleaning every deposit from animal use areas in the yard, allowing beetles a window of time, particularly in warm weather, to detect and respond to fresh material before it's removed entirely. In pasture settings, leaving some areas of the landscape with soil disturbance, bare patches, or low vegetation cover gives the beetles the open ground access they prefer for both foraging and orientation. If you find one in a pool filter, on a deck, or inside a screened porch, all documented backyard occurrences, relocate it gently to a garden area near any soil with animal use history, and it will find its way from there. These are resilient, purposeful animals with a navigational toolkit that was working before the first mammal walked the earth. It's been doing this job since dinosaurs were still using your neighborhood as a pasture, but you almost stepped on it. Or worse, you spotted it and actively tried to shoo it away. So instead, next time you see one, that jewel-colored horned thing catching light near the lawn, just leave it. It knows exactly what it's doing down there. It's been doing it a lot longer than we've been watching. Hey, if you made it this far, try to find a cool insect emoji and drop it in the comments. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on the next one.